This must be the crowd that when they hear the word data, you get little goosebumps and want to get up. Though it's exciting on a Tuesday morning. Come on, have a seat. And you show up. Let me. When you were asking a minute ago about Fitbits and Jawbones, my Jawbone and my Fitbit are charging this morning. It's just of all days to not bring them. I'm so sorry, but because I'm going to put your hands up if you're strapped to one of those. Okay, so not many of you. You're not. Yeah, you have like multiple. Have you ever met the lady that wears like 110 different versions? Yeah, she spoke. No, she literally has about 110 versions of different things. We had her speak last year. But I want to get back to it because I thought in the spirit of this morning and thinking about data, these questions of sharing, the big challenge for me in the wearables, measurable data, and sort of confession space is how many buddies I want to have. Because they can see not only your achievements, but your failures, right? So it's one of the things we'll get to later, and I want to ask some of you directly, how do you deal with failure among your peers? We should create an Atlantic GSK buddies group, I guess, on this. But in any case, what we're here today to talk about with some great folks is digitizing the patient experience. And we have Donna Cryer of the Global Liver Institute. I think it's okay, if I may, to share that you're a liver transplant survivor. You have a very personal stake. There's an amazing article out there where you fired your doctor and you told people why your experience was so miserable and what your level of expectations were. Stephen, you had a son with a rare disease, and you've become one of the great inspirations in bringing hope to people that are in the rare disease arena.
Have,
exactly. Marci, and Chris, you're both in patient advocacy. Marci pulled me aside and said, I know you worked in the Senate, Steve, and you used to work for Bob Kerrey. And you said, I like Bob Kerrey. You could go anywhere or say anything. And so we're on edge with that. But it's great to have you. And Chris, I wanted to start with you for a moment and ask, I just read a piece that you had written where you talked about the data palooza out there. And you were really embracing that. But in many of the areas in which you're thinking and working with primary care and all this, I'm interested in how you see data as a game changer in a very real human way, because what I liked about it was the human face you put on this issue, but data sometimes doesn't feel very human to me, and I'm interested in how you square that.
No, I think you raise an excellent point. I mean, data itself is not human. I mean, that's mostly for the geeks, as I always say. I say data is for the geeks, information is for the patients, the consumers. So I think right now where we are is that HDC, Health Data Consortium, focused a lot on data liberation and from its inception up till now. Where we are right now is focusing on actionable insights from the data. We really want to move from just talking about data as a substantive thing itself and move more into how you extract insights for it to make key decisions. I think from policy to clinical to and as HCC itself, we are even getting involved at the community levels to really talk about it from how do you build this whole concept of smarter cities or healthier communities. So really it's about extracting insights from the data.
When you think about the terrain of who the stakeholders are, because I think one of the things that we just heard was that is not only data out there, but bringing the various players in to share, to understand, to play across platforms. And when you're building a consortium, who's in the consortium? Who matters?
Our focus is on building a multi-stakeholder consortium. I mean, the greatest challenge we have is the data silos, and those are only perpetuated by, no offense, but the trade associations and those that are advocating on behalf of
Go ahead and be offensive.
Well, I'm going to be. I'm just trying to preface it with an apology. But so I think that what's going to happen is that we have to move beyond these silos of organizations or constituencies that are focused on advocating on their own behalfs and think about how we affect the entire system. So with Health Data Consortium as a multi-stakeholder group, we're thinking we're bringing everyone into the fold. That includes life sciences, that includes consumers, which are typically the underrepresented groups when we're having these discussions here in Washington. So,
Marci, you also do something that's very human. You're looking at, I don't know how to call it, but sort of later stage primary care, elder care, looking at transitioning, and bringing this. And I thought, when I was thinking about this morning, my brother works in this area. It seemed to me, and I'm clearly ignorant, that this is the area that would have been less permeable and changeable by data. but your material in here seems to indicate otherwise. So how is data potentially transforming what to me looks like the very heavy lift of primary care, of in-home? How do you take something that seems to be so human intensive, man hours intensive, and change the game?
Well, Chris spoke to the importance of multi-stakeholders, and that's really what we are at the Patient-Centered Primary Care Collaborative. We were founded by the physician primary care organizations together with IBM and other large employers. And basically they said, if we've got data and we understand the system is broken, how can we work together to drive change, a more effective healthcare system in terms of costs, but more importantly, how do we improve health and population health? Obviously is sort of the new it girl in terms of public policy.
Can you walk us through that? Like, what does that really mean?
So what it means is we have trained our clinicians in this country, and by the way, we're now well beyond just the docs. We've got the nurses, the social workers, the pharmacists, and the behavioral health folks. Everybody's at the table. What they're all trained to do is focus on the patient in front of them, and the patient in front of them's symptoms, their challenges, their barriers, their diagnosis, often thinking myopically about medicine. What we're trying to do is change the entire paradigm so that we're now looking at that person and thinking about their circumstances, not that all those things aren't important relative to that individual's health, but what do we know about a person with this set of characteristics that the data can help us understand how to better treat them, and then we can use their data as part of a bigger, broader system to say, clearly, there are trends here. We're doing all kinds of things in the U.S. health system that are incredibly wasteful and inefficient. And using data, we can start to drive change in the culture of medical service delivery. So we've got to change the way in which we practice in this country. It's very inefficient. It's fragmented, as Chris spoke to. And it's also far too focused on sickness. You asked folks about their Fitbits, et cetera. What would happen if we used data to drive wellness, and if the interaction between that clinician and that patient was not just focused on when you're sick or now that you're sick, but what do you care about? What's your priority? How do you want to engage in this world so that you're feeling healthy and productive? And then we focused on keeping them healthy. And of course, there's a whole spectrum there between health and illness. And primary care is the place in which we sort of see it all. So we feel like if you can have a close relationship, a partnership with a primary care provider team, we can drive a lot of the changes that improve the health, but also improve the overall healthcare costs.
So I don't want to leave you yet. Does Obamacare help you get there in this transition from fee for service to sort of a more holistic outcome, as I understand it? Maybe I'm reading it wrong. But one of the arenas, and Chris, I know you're tied in this as well, that I find to be a big unknown now, that you're talking about a big cultural shift. I mean, I've been reading a lot of what this lady here has been writing. She's tough on the system, right? So, and she's not very happy with people out there. And, I recently lost someone in my family, and I have to say, in my experience going through it, I had more experiences along the line. But you're talking about needing to inculcate a vast number of people with a very different cultural orientation about how they look at outcomes, how they look at their daily. You have sort of mentors and coaches, and you've got greater predictability out there. That seems to me, I mean, I love the idea, but I'm just wondering if you're a naive utopian.
I am a naive utopian, let me own that up front. But it's possible, and we see pockets of it all over the United States. Although I'd want to underscore that Donna's concerns about our broken health system are very real. I have very ill family members for the first time in my own family. I'm the only one with a healthcare background. It's broken. So the paradigm shift that we're talking about, I think, is really just picking up steam. The specific question that you asked was around Obamacare. I gave so many lectures on what this legislation was before it was law, and it's important to remember the law itself was focused largely on coverage and access and health insurance. it really just played around the margins when it comes to culture change in healthcare delivery. We're making a bunch of important investments in pilots and initiatives that allow us to test this utopian theory that I'm suggesting. The evidence isn't clear one way or the other. We hear about one ACO, we hear about one big PCMH, patient-centered medical home initiative. It's always important to look for trends, and the trends actually are quite positive, but without everybody getting in alignment.
No, I like your research and empiricism. And you don't often hear about the overtreated American. Shannon Brownlee has written a lot about this.
That's right.
And others, but it's not something where you sort of see that realization of an overtreated American or a mistreated American, in fact, is out there. Donna, I need to read from your article. She has an article here called Why I Fired My Doctor and What You Should Look For in Yours. I'm going to use this all the time, but there's this great piece where he says, indeed they chose someone, we'll get into who they is, or maybe he drew the short straw, who although young in age, had a very old and paternalistic view of the doctor-patient relationship. We clashed in every way. He would not accept my concise written summary of my extensive medical history, although the folks at NIH appreciated it. I guess I was an unreliable witness as well as an incredibly hostile one. He would not accept my blood pressure readings over the phone, which I found very ironic since while on the phone I was editing a report as part of a technical. I mean, so you you have very high expectations of your medical care, and you in your engagement with you said, what I'm getting is not enough, and you took responsibility for that and you changed it. But walk us down that line because it's fascinating, and I want to know if you have a doctor you like now.
I do. I have several. So you've let the cat out of the bag underneath the sweet exterior. That I actually have. It's interesting. In starting the Global Liver Institute in the past year, not only can I say that I have positive relationships with one or more physicians, but one that's so positive that one of the transplant fellows from 20 years ago has now come to work with me on this cause and institution. So what I think every day, what gets me up in the morning is that if it's this hard for someone like me, someone highly educated with a law degree. I did start as a federal prosecutor, so that may be the tone you see in some of the things.
I am intimidated.
With a physician husband, who has been doing this a while. My first diagnosis was for inflammatory bowel disease over 30 years ago. I'm over 20 years with a liver transplant. I'm only about 2 months with knee replacements right now, so I'm sort of new to orthopedics, but we're redesigning that as well. But I've learned a few things along the way, and so I expect that is respected, that I have an expertise in me, if nothing else. The fact that I get to or have chosen to do this sort of as a career as well and serve on a lot of committees, that's great, and that's sort of not the average. But just as a patient who has lived every day 24/7 with me, noticing every symptom, I'm the only one who has access to 40-some years of data on me.
Right.
And that's an incredible resource for my doctors to be able to tap into, to be able to treat me effectively and efficiently. And so there is a sense of frustration when that's not respected. And so if it's this hard for me to get high quality care, I think, well, what do other people do? In many cases, they die, is the cold, hard truth of it, because they are getting misdiagnosed, or something's ignored, or they're pushed into treatments. The overtreatment has sort of two faces. Sometimes they're pushed into treatments that they don't want to have in the first place, when they would really prefer something much more lower tech, or something at home, or something very simpler. So I really spend most of my thinking, if it's this hard for me, what do other people do? And that's why I sort of have to keep up the fight.
Part of this discussion today is about, the new opportunities in data, but the patient-centered experience and how that can be very different. And when I was thinking about you and your experience. You're so much more literate in all of this than I. I mean, I'm illiterate by choice in this arena, but I mean, I'm just wondering, what is the responsibility of the patient on that end to enhance literacy, to understand, to maybe perhaps take advantage of their own data out there, and to kind of amp up, if you will, in this? It's clear to me you did that, but you're such a highly unusual person. I mean, I can't imagine anyone I know manhandling a doctor like you did.
It's fun to watch sometimes, actually. Now my husband just sort of sits back and
I see a new reality TV
enjoys
show.
the show. It could be. Let's talk about this. But I didn't. They didn't teach hepatology in law school. They didn't teach orthopedics or gastroenterology or hepatology or reproductive endocrinology or half the things that I've had to have a very steep learning curve to learn to save my own life. So there is a burden on patients to become more literate, and most patients and their families, usually there's someone in the family who helps sort that out. One of the things, though, that I've come to realize that for patients, particularly with multiple chronic diseases, and we're seeing more and more of those, not only in the Medicare population, but at far younger ages, that it really is the cumulative burden of what I have to do every day as a patient to stay well. It's a very high bar. It could be a full-time job. And so is that a realistic expectation of patients? So while we talk about having empowered patients, patients who are equipped, and I think that the focus really should be on redesigning the healthcare system to make it easier on patients and families, and to take that burden off, because we weren't trained to do this. I didn't go to school for this. I didn't apply for a job in doing this. I don't get a check for doing healthcare. The doctors, the clinicians, the nurses, the social workers, they did. And so my expectation now, and the work that we're doing with the Global Liver Institute and others, and in partnership with organizations, is how can we take the burden off of patients and families rather than heap more and more expectations on them, so that the system works more, and the system sort of the larger ecosystem of not just when you're in the hospital or when you're in an outpatient facility, but the wholeness of a person's life, that can tip the balance between them being in the hospital and living in illness, or living a very full and rich life. That burden really is taken on by the healthcare system and the social resources system, and not placed at the feet of patients and their families.
Stephen, you have a powerful story as well.
Yes. So I have a son with a rare disease that was diagnosed when he was a 3-year-old boy, and he's 28 now. And when he was about 13, a medicine was finally developed for the first time ever, and was safe and effective, but not approved by the FDA yet, and so nobody could have it. And the reason I can say that this medicine I saw in the laboratory in the late 90s is safe and effective is because it was finally approved in 2014, so many years later. That's how long it took just to get through the government-mandated, FDA-regulated approval process. And there were a number of other very biochemically similar medicines that have come through the process for similar diseases, all of which had almost no side effects. And side effects and danger is the reason we have a regulatory process, is to protect us and keep us safe. But back in those days, when I first went to the FDA and my members of Congress and complained and said, the FDA doesn't listen to the pharma companies don't feel confident to go talk to the FDA, nobody wants to bring the patients into the discussion. And I was surprised back then, this was the year 2000, that the FDA officials I talked to said, you're absolutely right, that's how the system works, and we don't like it either, but that is the way it is. So what's changed is we have all this retrospective learning and the collaboration between all the parties that Chris mentioned, and I think everybody's mentioned here, this working together across the parties and trying to make the whole system better is really how things are beginning to accelerate. So now we see trials like that one approved, not taking 15 years, and sometimes not even taking all 3 phases of the regulatory process, but the FDA has become flexible, and they bring patients in and they listen to patients, and that's because of laws passed recently by Congress because of patient advocates' direct intervention, patients like Gretchen sitting here, and things that I did and lots of people I know. But it takes many people. It takes the whole country and all the parties.
And I think that's the difference that you're seeing, too, that it's not just sort of about patients or for patients or with a theoretical patient in mind, but that we're actually at the table. And when we talk about determining the risk and benefits of a particular drug, they're actually asking us, well, what risk would you take on, and how do you see the benefits?
Yes.
And that's often very different from what the biostatisticians or biochemists on the advisory committees would think of as a risk that someone would be willing to take. Our view of that is often very, very different, and that's now better represented within the drug development process. And I think, and it's definitely changing the pace as well as the quality of the drugs that are going through.
So a way this change is occurring, just yesterday I was in a meeting, and today I'm going to be in a different one. These meetings to talk about how do we change the data includes how do we change the kind of data that Gretchen was just talking about, where she said the doctor didn't really want to take my input, didn't consider me the expert, and she was probably talking to the doctor and willing to write things. But what we're talking about now, and we're talking about it with government, with pharmaceutical companies, with the FDA and patient advocates, all in the same rooms when we talk about this, how to incorporate that kind of unstructured data in a very formal way that the scientific analysis at FDA could use it, together with the clinical data, and then going on beyond that with genomic data.
So, first of all, I know that you're Gretchen on Mondays, but Donna on Tuesdays.
Donna.
So this is Donna. But
You should have said.
yeah.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right.
She'll get you later. But are there models, so I had heard you and read you in the past when you were talking about that the HIV AIDS advocacy groups changed the game. And I've talked to Anthony Fauci and others that make very clear that was a game changer in what was possible. It's not been clear to me, and it's perhaps I haven't seen it, with your son's case with the rare disease arena that you've been so active in. Are there clear models that you can bring to the system, to the various players, and say, this is the way it should be? And are they buying in? Or do you find the incumbency and inertia of the way the system operated very resistant to saying, here are the new model? I mean, I'm just sort of interested in whether these are earnest, good people that are buying into a potentially different way to think about data and drug approvals, or whether they're just stuck in old ways of doing things. When you think about 15 years ago, what the way the world looked like, it's almost Neanderthal, right, where we were. So 15 years is so long. Are they changing it? Are they aware of the models?
There absolutely is our models, and there is absolutely change. So one place we can see it is the House of Representatives just passed by an overwhelming bipartisan vote the 21st Century Cures Initiative, which would change lots of the ways we manage data and collect data and use data and approve drugs. Because they see the whole thing backsliding into the past, and we need to move into the future. So rare disease patient advocates and many others are calling our members of the Senate now and saying, we need you to be vocal about this and support what so overwhelmingly passed the House after such thorough discussion across all stakeholders. And the model in the change is looking at including all the members of our society and the whole system. So how do it talks about data sharing, data flexibility, and ways, for example, to share data across institutions, not just in each single company that does a clinical trial, but when a data pool exists, it should be used by any legitimate researcher. So we have elements in these new laws that will allow that. But the major part of this whole thing is it's now considered to be the norm that we will change. And if we went back 15 years, the mantra was always, we could never approve a clinical trial that way. Millions could be harmed. So don't even talk about that. You just don't understand. That's how patient voices were disintermediated at the time, marginalized. But now everybody realizes change has been happening, and there's going to be more change. So we'll define a law which is imperfect and then march down that path. And And if anybody says that's not perfect, don't pass the law, they're just holding everything up.
So let me ask all of you, and I want to go to the audience soon, about the privacy part of this. All of you have given sort of earnest, smart ways to think about how the world could be very different with data, how we can work with it. I grew up, as a gay man and worried about 1980s, and I'm okay, but had friends that were infected with HIV, and were it to become known, it would have destroyed their lives. There's just no doubt. We've lived in a political town, the stories of vetting people and going out and finding records where it shows something about them, psychological treatment, et cetera, other medical problems they may have, become ways in which people have undone political careers. So, this notion that there's no consequence is something very hard for some people to believe. And so the patient privacy dimensions are very robust in this debate as well. So how do you square privacy concerns, which I would tell you, I've seen real world examples where they were absolutely real. Donna?
There are consequences, and I think that when we create these infrastructures, that we need to be cognizant that there's a spectrum of personal preferences of privacy. I drive a red car with liver lady plates, so clearly I'm on one end, one end of the spectrum about how open I am about the conditions that I have. But it's equally as valid for someone not to want to disclose information, certainly that publicly, but even just within their health system or within certain doctors. And so one of the things that I've seen that I want to make sure flourishes is the patient control, very granular levels of patient control of their data and how it's used, and being understanding how it's used in different situations. So you may be able to say, and that may change over the course of your lifetime as a patient. It may change at different points in your the life cycle of your disease. If you're not doing well, you may feel that you want to keep your data very close. If you are really sick and need access to trials and are really willing to have your information shared quite broadly in hopes of a cure, then you may want to set your sharing settings very different. So I think when we create systems that allow granular and changeable ways of patients expressing their preference for how their data is shared, and also doing some job in terms of educating people about the fact that your data is being shared in a lot of different circumstances. Where is it going? How is it being used? What's the value of sharing your data, so that you can really be a participant in this process and not just having policies where it's sort of all or nothing. We're sort of taking people's data and using it different ways, and people really aren't involved in that process.
And I've noticed in cancer, Susan Love is bringing a lot of people into cancer research on that. Autism groups and Alzheimer's groups are building bigger data pools among members and bringing that, particularly genetic data with the case of autism. It's fascinating that they're trying to basically genetically code 10,000 individuals and family members that are tied into that. And so you see these collectives growing, but they tend to be from the advocacy groups.
I think the reason that, and there are a lot of data repositories and biobanks and registries from the physician side or medical society side or academic medical centers. Why you're seeing patient advocacy organizations taking that on really is, in most part, in my view, for that sense of control about the data, as well as the agenda for what research is going to be done. Is this data being used to answer questions that actually matter to me? I'll read a lot of journals, a lot of literature, and it's great they have these studies, but it bears no relevance to what I, as someone going through life with a disease, cares about.
Marci, how's it hit your world?
Well, it's hit our world in various ways. We tend to look at the unit that we're trying to impact in the world of the PCPCC as being the primary care practice.
Right.
Having that primary care practice optimized so that they've got a relationship with every patient that is person-centered and respects them as a whole person, to the extent that they have different opinions and thoughts about privacy is incredibly important. On the other hand, we've got all kinds of providers, clinicians, hospitals, et cetera, who use HIPAA as a shield to not share information.
Well, I was going to ask you who the bad guys were.
Oh, well, I understand the frustration, but the reality is HIPAA is misinterpreted all the time, mostly in ways that are sort of defensive from a clinician perspective. That doesn't help patients, but it also doesn't help society as you talk about what we can learn from patient advocates who want to share their experience and their data to prevent somebody, perhaps, from suffering from a disease later. I do think, and everybody in this audience is probably aware of this, we're a very bifurcated world when we talk about patients and diseases, and then we talk about consumers and health. And the folks who are the unfortunate victims of an illness that is serious, they often do get engaged in their health. They may not be as bright as Donna and run a whole organization. They are often disempowered, and they join patient advocacy organizations and get power, as Steve pointed out. But what about the rest of us who aren't ill yet or don't have a sick family member yet? What are we doing to change a broken healthcare system? And so we can't just change the illness system. We've got to change the whole health system so that across the board we're thinking about patient consumer preferences. Privacy is one of many. Cost matters. Overuse matters. Underuse matters. Misuse matters. And so without data and freely shared data that allows us to look at patterns and identify trends, when it comes back to the clinician and the patient in front of them, we're going to grow, unfortunately, a mistrust over time. And that's sort of sacred in my opinion. That trust between a patient and their doctor is really important. And in a world where we're questioning privacy, but honestly, and you made this point, Steve, the rest of the world is getting lots of information about us every day, and most of it's on Facebook and Twitter.
Exactly. Chris and Stephen, if you could quickly sort of take us down, but let me offer a preamble on this. Sort of, I have this view of data. I love data. I love the whole notion of change, and I guess whenever I do these Atlantic events, I worry that we're talking about even though we're talking about the world 5 years ago. We're talking about yesterday. And when you're really talking about the sort of world that Marci just described, or what you're trying to do in your advocacy, a very different platform, very different culture. And I think sometimes it's hard to dream up what that looks like in an effective way, but I think that's our task in some ways. And don't ask me why. I was watching Little House on the Prairie the other day. I am a little embarrassed by Melissa Gilbert's going to run for office somewhere. I went back to look at it. And you look at that used to be a big frame of how Chris doesn't even know what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about. I was young, but I do know what you're talking about.
Look, we'll have TV night. I'll invite you over and take you into a very different world. But the point is that world, the at-home doctor, the paternalism that you were talking about in your article is out there. But I'm just wondering, particularly the efficiencies that come from lots of data ought to solve the rare disease problem in part, right? The rare disease problem that you're working on, and you've been so inspirational, received all these awards, et cetera, is there because there's no economy of scale that's easy and accessible. But data and all of these other things should level that out. That's what I'm thinking would be one element of a different world that we're going into. And as you bring in your consortia, the question is, we're going to talk to Niall in a few minutes, is, he's a data freak, right? And he swims in this stuff. Does that world really produce a dramatically different environment? I mean, like we see with iPhones today or something. But Stephen, Chris, quick answers.
Well, I think we should stop overprotecting the patient. I totally agree. There's too much saying we can't do that in the name of privacy. Patients want data to work for them. And we need large shared data pools so that we can start clinical trials for rare diseases that otherwise wouldn't start. And now that goes to the big common diseases too, because it's all genetic. And the rare disease folks were just really the pioneers on the frontier of all that. So we do need to stop with all the privacy protections. But your analogy from earlier about the gay rights activists and the AIDS activists setting a model, we also need in this change to make it clear to those who do go after people because they're sick, because their insurance rates are too high or their insurability is not good, that has to be stopped as part of the future model.
Chris?
You know, it's pretty interesting to hear him say that we should lessen the privacy restrictions, but and in some ways, as a data hippie, I agree. But I do think that there should be certain protections in place and certain transparency into the process for the patient to see and own where their data is going. But more importantly, I mean, there's so much emphasis on data, and I really want to reiterate the fact that it should be more about information. And where we are right now is at a time where there is an abundance of data. There is no shortage of data, I can promise you. But there's not very much information and knowledge because it's very messy. You know, I mean, the reason that Nile and CMS data is so valuable is because it's one of the fewer structured data sets that you can rely upon to have high quality. I think that we are extremely excited by seeing, you know, the innovators such as Apple and Google and these guys get engaged in producing these consumer-facing technologies that allow us to own or feel as though we own our data and direct it in the way that we deem necessary. But I do think that really where we are is in extracting insights from the data that is there, really from a democratization, I like to say, of data, of innovations, and of medicine, ultimately. I mean, that's why you see so many of these patient advocacy groups developing their own data repositories, trying to create their own version of a learning health system. And that's really where we have to go. So less about creating and generating more data, because trust me, there is a lot of it out there, more about taking the data, what we do have, and learning from it.
So let me ask you, I was thinking here, if I was running a consortium, the challenge of a consortium is you either have a lowest common denominator approach or a high common denominator approach. I mean, do you set, as you bring in your different stakeholders in the process and different tracks, different priorities, you know, different elements of financial incentive to take certain views, are you able to create, is it a lowest common denominator approach, or do you have a system that sort of helps everybody lift higher?
I mean, I think when you have an organization called the Health Data Consortium, it seems all-inclusive, right? I mean, so it's a very broad,
so who do you leave out?
It can feel as though you're boiling the ocean. We don't leave anyone out. No child left behind in our but the idea is, how do you manage mission or scope creep, right? How do you focus on particular issues that you can actually realistically and pragmatically address? And that's where we are, right? I mean, I think that I get calls all the time from people saying, well, you should be focused on this and this and this and this and this. And there's just not enough people, time, and money to address all these particular issues. So we tend to focus on the things that we can have the biggest bang.
Let me open. Oh, yes, Marci?
Can I make one really important point, in my opinion, relative to what Chris is talking about, where data and information aren't the same thing.
Right.
And that is, not only do we have a lot of data now, we have had a lot of data. That does not always drive change. Matter of fact, data alone rarely drives change, like in real people's lives. So you can data dump all you want on your patient, giving them information and educating them. That's not the same thing as engagement. And that is where I think we've got to come back to, what do we do with the data that inspires people to take responsibility for their health in a way that is easier than it is right now?
Interesting. Let me ask for any questions or comments. Where's the gentleman I promised the first question to? There you are. You're good. Okay, right here in the front. Yeah.
So I was noticing.
We're going to go get a mic to you. Tanisha.
So I was noticing that in my third graders enrichment programs this year, they are offering financial literacy.
Oh.
And I wanted to ask the panel, given your observations on the healthcare system, does the healthcare community need to do the same kind of investment to start teaching people about the system, even in third grade?
I say yes.
Yes?
I say
Yes.
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 Big yes. It is unbelievable. The whole system is stacked up against patients, right? If you go out and you read web evidence, you go do these things that are supposedly information out there. I mean, I'm going to pontificate for a moment after having gone through this the last year with someone. It's all this mysterious Wizard of Oz land that we normal human beings can't really understand, and you're automatically, it's kind of like the worst the Pope's coming to town, and I'm not a Catholic, but the whole notion of some infallible source. You get me going on this. So yes, health literacy is a huge issue, and then read her article. It's just really quite.
I'm gonna have to update my blog too.
Yeah, right here.
Sure. My name is Jennifer Salopek. I'm the editor of the Wing of Zach blog at the Association of American Medical Colleges.
Cool.
Sort of as a corollary to the idea of health literacy, I think that another important aspect of data in the future of patient care is equipping patients with data about their providers. And as you know, some academic medical centers and health systems have actually started using patient ratings and a la health grades, but more quantified and more qualified. Would just like to hear more thoughts, especially from Donna's perspective, on what she would do with that kind of information and how it might empower patients.
Absolutely. So I'll give you a real, very recent example. So just having knee surgery and figuring out who's going to do it, where is going to get it done, how are we going to go through this process. The problem with even the data that's currently available is, as you pointed out, it's siloed. So what I needed as a patient to be able to make a decision was I needed information on a physician who does the type of surgery, particular type of surgery that I needed, and the type of information I needed was, his, how many has he done? So because we know volume is, is correlated with better outcomes. So I needed the individual surgeon level information, but I also needed the facility level information to match it with. So where was I going to go after he did his great surgery? He can do the most perfect job in the world, but if I went into a hospital with high infection rates and everything, it was not going to go through. And then I also, they're prohibited in many ways of telling me, what rehab services that I could go. And I've seen a lot of innovation from some of the tech incubators and things that I know are members of the Consortium about helping to find those resources for as you're rehabilitating and things like that. So there are lots of pieces of information. So it's not just, can you find the right doctor? But as you think about an entire experience of care for something that's very, knee replacements are rather standardized. They're one of the most prevalent surgeries that's done, and how hard it was for me to find all the pieces of information that would help make an educated decision for a final outcome, which is not checking a lot of boxes about was there infection rate or but can I walk 2 months after the surgery and get back to work and things like that. So I think transparency around physicians is not only, their clinical care, but, do they have a participatory medicine style? So I won't have to.
Can I add something to that
quick.
point? So yes, but the question you raised, again, is back to this idea of information and informed choices, right? But I think but at the end of the day, if I were to come to you and say, you know what, I know this great orthopedic surgeon who did my knee, and it's almost like the word of mouth still supersedes all. So what we're still battling is this trust and reliability of online health information, right? So it can be based on solid data, reliable quality, high quality data, but word of mouth from someone else, even though that my orthopedic surgeon could have low ratings, will still supersede what's been published online. So we still have to address that trust and reliability issue.
I still think we need a TV show of super empowered patients, because most TV shows are super empowered doctors, right? House,
Yes.
all this. So anyway, this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so very much. Donna Cryer, Stephen Smith, Marci Nielsen, and Christopher Boone, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thank you all.
Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you.